I would like to offer some disclaimers at the outset because the general topic is experiences that I have met or faced largely from reading exams over a period of 37 years of teaching. Therefore, anything that is here in the way of content or anything provided, I am solely responsible for it, and Arizona State University has no idea what I'm going to say, nor does President Kaur for that matter. But I never really worry about President Kaur because he's a man who can stand the heat. I'll tell you something about our president. I was entering the Student Recreation Center one day in the late afternoon to play racquetball with two of my cronies. Two people back in line was president of the university, Kaur. And so I said to the receptionist and those who the one who checks our cards, "Excuse me," in a loud voice, "does he have to have the same type of identification to enter here that we do?" And before she could answer, President Kaur said, "Identical, same kind, except the picture on mine looks a lot better than the one on yours. He doesn't need any help. He can take the heat." Generally, the topic is, most of it, what has happened in exams that I have given over a period of many years, and some of them sometimes are shocking. In some cases, it is sad, the responses, the spellings particularly, but please understand at no time is there any intent here to ridicule any individuals, any groups or categories of individuals, or any institutions of any kind. Because it involves European history, and because it moves from the ancient world up to present times, in many cases what students fail to understand, or they misunderstood, or they attempted to take notes without doing any reading and seeing important things in print and having them explained in some more detail than they were by the professor giving the lecture. Because that's true, many times students say erroneous things. And in saying things that are erroneous, sometimes they are humorous. So if you have to read exams, the essays, let's say, for 20 hours, the only saving grace is to have the music from The Godfather playing in the background and work your 20 hours. Once in a while, you receive a lift because something is humorous. But at no time are we intending to ridicule or make fun of anyone or any group at this time. This just happened, and that's the way it happens to be. Now, some examples. When I first started teaching, it was 1960, and it was a discussion class for European civilization at the University of Southern California. And a teaching assistant is used in a variety of ways depending on the department and the subject matter. And in history, usually a teaching assistant, if it's a large institution, and you have senior members giving large lectures to the classes, then if the class has 400 students, they go to lecture 2 days a week in groups of 400, and then 1 day a week they are somewhere else in a classroom with 25 students, and the teaching assistant, who's working on his doctorate at that institution, then would meet with them for one of the 3 hours a week, and in the small group of 25 they would discuss the readings, the lecture topics, and other things in small group. That is a practice very common throughout the United States. And my first experience ever teaching was in 1960, and to walk into a room and facing it, and the first thing that happened after I called the roll was a young man in the back, who I later found out was a running back on the football team, immediately asked me a silly question about the score in the Coliseum. I had no idea what he was talking about, but the Coliseum is just across the way from USC. I said, "I don't know," and he gave me the score, and it was Romans 20, Christians nothing. That same student later, I realized, was one of the football team members, and I pointed out to him later he was a very average one, particularly at that. The most interesting development that occurred in class that involved current events topics or something that could be controversial arose during that semester about two-thirds of the way through the semester, and we had reached about the date 1200, and it was during the administration of the great, powerful, high medieval Pope Innocent III. And at that point, it so happened that the key feature in both Time magazine and Life magazine, both of which came out weekly at that time, was the topic, the population explosion, well featured on the front of the magazines with in-depth articles and other things of that type. So when class commenced, and we're talking about monarchy, the papacy, the church in the high Middle Ages, student raised his hand, he was a good student too, and said, can we spend the period today talking about the population explosion? At which time I said, well, no, that wouldn't really be proper. I'd be misusing the class time to do that. We're dealing with the 12th and 13th centuries here. He says, well, we've been dealing a lot with the Roman Catholic Church, haven't we? And I said, well, yes, that's true. And he said, well, most of the areas of the world, Latin America and other places, have a population problem, and the Roman Catholic Church doesn't condone birth control, and therefore I think that's really relevant to what we're doing. Well, being a monarchist, I don't like to tolerate these popular sovereignty, democracy type things that elevate in a class for some reason that would cause individuals to want to raise their hand and vote on something. But either way, I said, I'll tell you what, 15 minutes before the end of the period, someone raised their hand and anybody can say what they'd like to say that they know they've read about the population explosion. And so we arrived at that time. Let me give you one more proviso before we go on to this. In the course of reading exams in a class, especially if it deals with delicate matters of the religious nature, you quickly find out who in your class of 25 knows a great deal about religion, and they very well might know a great deal about their religion. In this case, there's only one universal church in 1200, in Western civilization, of course. And if they know a great deal, you can assume they studied hard in catechism, they've been reasonably well churched, and that appears exactly in their exams. Sacraments, they're familiar with all the sacraments, all the terminology, excommunication, interdict, papacy, all the things. Theocracy, theology, the saints. So that being the case, you notice that and you sense that in class. And anytime you can have a student in your class answer a delicate question for you, rather than you answer it yourself when it's posed by another student, the wise thing is to allow that student to do it. And you can quickly find out who those students are after you've graded 2 or 3 exams. So in this case, we move then to the population explosion for the last 15 minutes of the class, supposedly. And 2 or 3 people made a comment about this and that, and Latin America and the growing population there. And then one student on this side of the room said, well, I heard, or someone said recently, that the Roman Catholic Church had condoned some form of contraception, or birth control at least, birth control. I immediately knew exactly who to call on, and I said, Miss Jones, do you have any comment on that? And she said, yes, it is true that 2 months ago, the Roman Catholic Church approved of the rhythm system. And as the words rhythm system finished chiming from her mouth, the football player in the back row said, well, cha-cha-cha. Destroyed the class. Everybody had a wisecrack from that point on. 5 minutes later, I excused them for the last 10 minutes because we could never carry on the class again. But those are the things that will arise in class, and some of them will disrupt the class, and some will turn into good heated discussions with students showing concern about one thing or another. So I'm going to survey some of the spellings and some of the responses I have received in essay exams over 37 years. I decided to do this in my second year at Arizona State University, 1964. And the reason I chose to do it, when I read an exam, this was in Western Civ, and I looked at the exam, and the students had some short answers to write a paragraph on each. And one of the items was Emperor Nero. And a student wrote only one thing about Emperor Nero, and they were these words: Emperor Nero got PO'd and bugged out. Well, that was rather interesting. It was very educational for me. I did not know, really, how you abbreviated the past tense of pissed off. And here's a student teaching me. And it is properly P, small now, P period, O period, little ed. That's the past tense in abbreviation. So he's instructing the teacher in this case. Bugged out is just the slang for the day, isn't it? Well, I didn't know what to do with that, but he wasn't altogether wrong. It was worth 10 points to write on Nero, but it is true Nero did flee. He wasn't angry, but he was really afraid, but wasn't altogether totally wrong. So I gave him 2 points, and using the jargon of the day for him, I wrote in the margin, "Right on, baby." You can always use your red pen to say what you want, as long as you don't ridicule or demean somebody personally or individually. So from that time on, I started a folder, and I commenced collecting interesting, unusual, ironic, sometimes humorous items in my essay exams. Let's start off then with some of the spellings, and this is just a selection of the types of spellings that I have seen, all right? Let's start off first with herd mentality. Nietzsche wrote, in opposition to the tendency of individuals to be followers and not to stand out as individuals, they became a part of the herd. And the herd, H-E-R-D mentality, was what he was criticizing. Next we have, if anybody watching can visualize what that is, says Versailles, V-E-R-S-I-Z-E. And that is one of the most prominent palaces in the world, we find out. We have the word furor. You all know what it is, or what furor is, right? Okay? We find out that that is the title of a man named Hitler. And no doubt he wouldn't be completely wrong if he said Hitler was a furor. But obviously it's not spelled that way. We find that a conservative named Edmund Burke believed in the elite. Only this is elite. Okay. We run into a pope, and his name is Pius the Ninth instead of Pius the Ninth. Should be P-I-U-S. It's P-I-O-S here. That's incorrect. Nobody would probably be able to figure out what Saint-Simon is. But really it's a French socialist leader, 19th century, prominent writer, and his name is Saint-Simon. This word might cause a lot of difficulty for many people. Alsace-Lorraine. Right? We find it's the sister provinces of France taken by Germany in 1871, returned to France in 1919, Alsace-Lorraine. During the French Revolution, among the leaders who stand out, we have people like Danton, Saint-Just, and of course that ice blue, cold, methodical, ultra-virtuous, incorruptible Robespierre. But we have here Robust Pierre. I found out exactly how that came about. The student who wrote it hadn't come to class at the time and had purchased lecture notes that were for sale, that were taken by individuals who had them for sale, but who didn't take the class themselves, so they weren't doing any reading, so they come to class, take the notes, sell the notes, student buys the notes, but the person taking it, I guess it was my poor diction, thought I'd said Robust Pierre. But you have to be reading, and that's the problem. Not seeing it in print is what causes this. Here's another one, no booze. Now you might think that applies to a baseball stadium where they do not permit you to do what you could do when you're watching the New York Mets in New York, right? No. It's a practice of Muslims who do not use alcoholic beverages. No booze. Muslim church rule. And then here you have it simple and clear, a Spanish dictator in the 20th century whose first name happened to be Isimo, because everybody's heard of Generalissimo Franco. As they've heard of Generalissimo Stalin, Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, but nobody ever thought that their first name was Isimo. When I saw that, I merely wrote in the margin, when he was a little boy, did his mommy call him Issy? I couldn't resist. Here we have a nice one. I would never have been able to figure this out on my own if it hadn't been related to Paris and the Paris skyline. That is the famous tower in Paris built by Eiffel. Right? I fall. And then we have pheasants, an animal a bird that all Americans know. They are hunted widely. They were hunted in Europe as well. The problem is we have too many conditions in Europe during the Middle Ages in which the nobles or aristocracy are abusing the pheasants. We know they mean peasants, don't we? And we have individuals up on the rise, a new class of individuals, right? Very pushy in their economic ways. They are the nouveau rich. And we have a very unfortunate development, becomes very prominent in the late 19th century, and you see it reach its pinnacle in the Holocaust. That is anti-Semitic. Right? It's referred here to the Dreyfus affair, but to be anti-Semitic. I can't imagine the French being anti-Semitic. They care more about their language than most nations do and how it's used. During the discovery of the New World, Western Europe benefited from the rapid import of precious metals. Assumed they had been stolen from the Indians and had been wearing them through the forests of North America for victories they had won against one tribe or the other. We also notice that in the Middle Ages that there are occasions where there's pressure to free the serfs. Obviously the student thought that had to do with something connected with the beaches and the oceans of the world. We also have reference to medieval times. Evil before, evil after. This is the center. And we have some people called, if I pronounce it, you'll understand it immediately. But it's pronounced, or it's spelled Y-U-C-R-A-N-I-A-N-S. Those are Ukrainians, aren't they? And if I said Mein Kampf, you might say I was shortening something to say that it's my composition. Well, in fact, it was Hitler's composition, except that he dictated it and it was written down by Rudolf Hess while he was in prison. But it's Hitler's Mein, M-E-I-N, Kampf, K-A-M-P-F. Very, very famous work in history, but Mein Kampf. It comes from not seeing anything in print. And by the way, my students always have a selection from Mein Kampf, maybe two, that are assigned to them to read. So they also have something assigned in which the title is obviously there. And G-O-S-B-I-L. That's something that refers to, they are sometimes called the Synoptic, and they are the first 4 books, followed by the Acts in the New Testament. We have a religious order. Well, first we have the Son of God, Jesus, spelled with a J-E-A, which obviously caused the student to spell Jesuits, Jesuits. It logically fit. I just put down guess on that. The next one, Presbyterian and Pie Busters. Those individuals are the followers of Calvin, established in Scotland. You know them in Scotland and in the United States as Presbyterians, of course. You all know what Protestants are, but these are Protestants, and you also know what a Catholic is. This one is a Catholic. And the proper term for the seventh sacrament, last rites, that's W-R-I-T-E-S. Last rites is the sacrament of extreme unction. Here we have enjoying the benefits of extra unction. All comes with not reading, of course. Now let's go on to some examples of items written into the exam. On the ancient world, we'll start out there. We might move through it chronologically in this fashion. We have an individual, Paul of Tarsus, the most famous missionary in all of Christian history, and certainly the famous missionary of the first century of the expansion of Christianity from a simple Semitic sect in the Near East to Greece and ultimately to Rome and other reaches of Europe. And you know that all because of the activities and travels of Paul of Tarsus and all the epistles and letters he wrote to other Christian communities explaining what is the accurate interpretation of the teachings of Jesus. Here we have, along with Peter, he later went to Rome. Well, that's not altogether untrue, is it? Because he did roam a great deal. But we're really thinking of a city, aren't we? The capital of a great empire. Excuse me. Greek syllogism. Now, a Greek syllogism is a way of reasoning. It is associated with the development, evolution of philosophy and represents certainly the sophistication of Greek life because if you're only grubbing in the soil and picking berries, you don't have a sophisticated civilization, and the Greek civilization became very, very sophisticated and refined, as we know, through the writings, the architecture, the art, the commerce, and other activities. Laws developed, and of course, ultimately philosophy, when you have time to think about other things, contemplate change. Sophisticated society reaches a particular level, if that's the case. Now, the syllogism is most common one given in any textbook would be, man is mortal, Greeks are men, therefore Greeks are mortal. And it gives you an example of the reasoning, how you can conclude this to be true, because if this is true, then you link to this. That is the case. Student told me this: man is mortal, dog is mortal, therefore man is dog. I don't know what you do with that, but the formula seemed to be there, didn't it? Oh, last one. Plato's theory of ideas and forms. This is a little more complicated. Plato is telling us that reality exists in perfection of certain items to which you could give a title. And so Plato is saying that there is something as perfect beauty. We only know of beauty to the degree that anything around us or ourselves partake of the reality of beauty. So we are beautiful only on the basis of how much beauty we partake of, the perfection, the perfect beauty. The same would apply to the term justice. Justice is real, only real in that you partake of it. Now, if you're dealing with these ephemeral type things with a class, and they are very important to deal with them, you must, because sooner or later you arrive at a point in which you're trying to explain how Christian theologians can say that the Trinity is real. Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit are not three separate things. They are the Trinity. And if you're trying to use philosophy and logic to show the Trinity has reality in itself as a triune entity, then you need these Greek techniques and practices in order to explain that. The time of the early Christian church, and the education obviously had languished way behind. You need all the tools, accoutrements that you can have intellectually to explain and interpret as Christian theology evolves. So, on the exam, the student was supposed to write paragraph on Plato's theory of ideas and forms. So here we have it. A rat is less perfect than the idea of rathood. Why the student came up with the rat, I have no idea, but I know exactly the example I gave in class, and it was this. A tiger or a lion, a lynx, or the cat in your house all have something in common. It's called feline characteristics. And I used that as an example and indicated that if Plato had chosen to discuss felinity, that's what would be our real. Cats would be real to the degree that they partook of the ideal of felinity or had felinity in some way. Student answered the question, but for some reason chose to use rats and rathood. I had never heard of rathood as such. On the Peloponnesian War, the long drawn-out war between the League of States headed by Athens and that of Sparta, one individual criticized the wars that dragged on, and some criticized it, and even one playwright did that in the play Lysistratus, because after all, sooner or later there are shortages, more disease breaks out when there are shortages, and levels of nutrition drop, and it drags on, and many would like to bring it to an end. Now somebody who is domestic and in Athens, who criticizes the war and could disrupt an assembly and change people's feelings about the war, for that disruption, you must shut them up. And the Greeks weren't a particularly harsh people in that. So a common form of shutting someone up is to put them out of the purview where they can say anything at all. So you could sentence an individual to ostracism. And if they're condemned to ostracism, you merely ferry them to an island somewhere where they can't communicate with anybody, therefore their words can't cause any trouble, and that is the way it is done. So it's a very convenient, it's not unlike in the 19th century when leaders of riots in England, rather than make a martyr out of them by hanging them for riot, instead you sentence them to 15 years transportation, which means they get a trip to Australia and can't come back for 15 years. So, Peloponnesian War, student said this, Themistocles opposed it and as a result was ostracized. Didn't know the Greeks had the invention. All right. Move on then in history to a later period. Indulgence. This is a term I also need to explain to you. An indulgence merely is a concession that there are certain deeds or functions, outright actions that you might be granted an excuse from performing because of some other great contribution that you are doing. So at one time in history, when the Pope granted an indulgence so that Spanish soldiers could eat meat on Friday, that's an example of an indulgence because of the rigors of military life and the need for the nourishment and the protein value of meat. Right? And if you went on a crusade, you were contributing a great deal, exposing yourself to famine and disease and obviously Saracen spears, and therefore he might grant an indulgence to excuse you from your temporal duties and regular religious practices for a certain period of time. The papacy, that was known in the Middle Ages, and a grant of that type was acceptable. In the middle of the 14th century, Pope Clement VI made more sophisticated the interpretation of indulgences and indicated that it was possible for a person to gain benefit from an indulgence by making a particular contribution in some way, and that contribution could be monetary. Now we have the seeds of something that could be abused, and this is not anything that is critical of Christianity or critical of the official teachings of the church, but rather critical of the practice of clergymen who are human beings like you and I and can abuse it. Any human can abuse it, and they are no more than human. So when that grant was made, within a century it led to the practice in many cases of individuals making a donation and receiving a certified piece of paper, and it indicated there was a decrease in purgatory time, which maybe your aunt would spend in purgatory. After all, she's died, nobody knows how long she's going to be there, but you might make a grant in her name and reduce her purgatory time or your purgatory time in the future. That is abuse of it, and it's being used in an abusive way. That's what would irritate Martin Luther, of course. And Martin Luther is just saying this never should have developed. The practice wasn't there at the time of St. Augustine in 400. Why is it here now? So that's the indulgence. And the abuse of it or sale of them, rather than asking you to be contrite of heart and do something physically for your fellow man to warrant this, even if there is a purgatory and you could have the time reduced. Student said this, a theory that depends on whether, and he spelled it like the weatherman, on whether the soul went to heaven. Luther said you could not buy time. Buy an indulgence and have a clean slat. Well, that's all you had to do, right? Now, after the Reformation developed in the first quarter of the 16th century and expanded to where you had a Lutheran church and by then a Calvinist church, and there were other churches nurturing, and there were reformists and independents and individuals trying to purify the Anglican Church of England. And by this time Presbyterianism, a Calvinist form, was spreading in Scotland. All of those developments occurred, and the Universal Roman Church had a grand conclave at the Council of Trent, the purpose of which is to answer criticisms and statements and practices of the Protestants, to evaluate all basic Christian doctrine of the Universal Roman Church, and at that convention they concluded that all three parts of the Universal Church are equally sacred. Holy Scripture, all of the theological interpretations of the Catholic fathers, such as St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, so forth, and then all of the laws of the church that have been developed premised upon either the Bible or the theological teachings of the church fathers. They could be in the form of canon law, it could be statements of ecumenical councils, or statements of the papacy in the form of a papal bull, the official statement from the throne by a pope a bull. So it could be all of those. They're all equally held as sacred, not just Scripture. Luther's waving the Bible, so is John Calvin, and they're going no further than that. If it's not here, it's not to be had. And so the church gathered, and they looked at all of these things, the sale of indulgences, the use of relics as instructional tools, the participation in pilgrimages to gain some holy benefit from it, all the practices that you considered semi-ceremonial but had a tremendous influence and were very popular with the masses as such, miracles. All of this was confirmed 100%, and then the council went on to form a list of forbidden books that might corrupt the minds of serious believers who are members of their church. So it's one of the most important ecumenical councils ever in history, and the individuals who prepared the agenda, carried out the debates and discussions. The leadership for all of this was a new order, very militant, organized on a military basis, the Jesuit Society, Society of Jesus, founded by Loyola. Very, very dedicated, very, very strict, founded more educational institutions than any order ever in human history, and proved to be the best trained teachers in all of Europe. They were the guides for this particular Council of Trent, and all basic doctrine was reaffirmed and no compromise of any kind with the Protestant claims on any of the issues that had been attacked by the Protestants. So, students are writing on the Council of Trent, part of what's called the Catholic or Counter-Reformation. Student says it's a meeting of religious scholars, which it was. We'll come back to the Council of Trent in a little bit, as it flows on the exams that I read. Then we come to King John of England. Yes. King John. Interesting thing about King John is he picked 3 fights in his life of importance, and he lost all of them, the last one being with the barons. But one of the fights he picked was with the most powerful pope of the High Middle Ages, Innocent III. And he wanted to appoint his own Archbishop of Canterbury, but the canons of Canterbury elected their own. And then he was furious at that, so he sent his own candidate to Rome to be anointed by the Pope. So now the Pope has 2 candidates there, one from the canons of the cathedral, one from John, and he chooses to himself his own candidate for the throne, one Stephen Langton, who was a very competent scholar as well as a strong leader, living in Western France at the time, and sent him there. John wouldn't accept him or allow him in England. And as a result, there was a standoff between John and the Pope. He defied the Pope, did not fill various offices. If a bishop died, he would not fill it, merely collect all the money that came into the diocese for himself, and so he's defying the Pope. Eventually, the Pope moved to the point where he excommunicated John. Excommunication places an individual beyond the reach and benefits of the sacraments to bring pressure upon that person for him to repent and hence ask for absolution, after which he would be assigned some sort of penance to do in one way or another. John continued to defy the Pope, and then John took the ultimate step. Pope Innocent III took the ultimate step. He placed over England an interdict, I-N-T-E-R-D-I-C-T, interdict, from the Latin to forbid, prohibition. And that means in that geographical area, none of the sacraments could be performed unless there was an alleviation in somewhere for, let's say, burial. But that was placed on all of England. It's not totally unusual in history for that to happen. It happened in the 20th century for almost 3 years, just south of the border in Mexico, during the time that Plutarco Calles was the power man in Mexico in the 1920s. So, here is the incident that you have, and that's the situation you have. The Pope has placed an interdict on all of England. Here we have. All right, see what we report. In 1207, the Pope laid the interdict on England. The Pope abused his tool of excommunication. It's interesting, when that was written, I read it, and the first line was, the Pope abused his tool. It was on the second line that I found, of excommunication. So where am I going here with this? But either way, it was there. We have another case just as much a violation of the word interdict that we will come to later. Now, the First Crusade, which was preached in 1095, reached the Holy Land. about 1098. All right? I'm sure you have a general familiarity with the Crusades. Was proclaimed by Pope Irving II. If anyone is listening and they believe that we've had a pope named Irving, then please, please write someone about it and surprise them. That's what you could do. When I saw that, I wrote in the margin, was this pope by chance from Brooklyn? I couldn't resist. I couldn't resist. John Huss. John Huss was a Czech, a citizen of Bohemia and of Prague, and he was very critical of the church. And we're talking about here the late 14th century, moving up into the 1500s. And what he was critical of was the conduct of the clergy. And we already indicated any human being can do abuse or carry out abuse. It has nothing to do with attacks on Christianity as such. It's not. It's the conduct of the individuals that do not follow the prescriptions of their office. And John Huss resented the fact that so many of the upper clergy were extremely wealthy, and they garnished all sorts of wealth of one kind or another. Furthermore, they sometimes had concubines. And how can an individual who's taken vows of celibacy for their office have concubines, illegitimate children, and then do favors for the illegitimate children, all the other things? And what John Huss said, and this is what really puts him into the fact or the position of heresy, Heresy, defined by the church, not as a crime against the church, but as a crime against God. The church will evaluate and judge which items are heretical. So understand heresy, a very severe crime. So John Huss was lapsing into that, but he had plenty of sympathizers in Bohemia who did not like the particular wealth of the leadership of the church or their conduct as such. And what he was asking for is for the lower clergy and the parishioners to have judgment over who should be their priest or their bishop because they wanted someone. Or let's put it another way. He was able to convince people that when the sacraments were performed and the Mass carried out in ceremony by somebody who themselves lived in a state of sin, the sacraments wouldn't have their effect as they should for the true believer. Now something's being stolen from the faithful, isn't it? That's what John Huss is talking about. That's his claim here. And he's trying to prove this. But the point is, he's the underling reaching up. And church is hierarchical and authority flows from top down. Low laymen do not judge, nor do lower clergy judge. You can get into the problem of heresy. So here, John Huss was a hairy tick who had a safe conduct pass when he was called to air his views at the Council of Constance. His safe conduct was guaranteed. This says conduct. And his safe conduct was guaranteed so he could air his views there. And so he came to express his views, and he tried to convince all the leaders of the church who had come from all over Europe to gather there at the Council of Trent, right, about 1412. And they would meet for 2 or 3 years. As a matter of fact, the main reason they were meeting was to solve the problem that there were 2 popes at the time, and they had to get back to 1 pope in all of this. So they're trying to solve a serious problem, a papal schism in the church that had been aggravating and gnawing since 1378. So that is a very severe problem, but also the conduct of the clergy. So they let him come and air his views and gave him safe conduct, and was guaranteed by the German Emperor Sigismund. All right, but the student said he was a hairy tick, all right? And he was a Czech, notice that, C-H, he's one of these, right? A Czech nationalist who studied at the University of Prague and was into transubstantiation. Now we have this slang term today, oh, he's into that. Oh, you like music? Yes, I'm into Fleetwood Mac. Oh, I'm kind of into Ray Charles. I'm into something. Transubstantiation is the term for the miraculous transformation of the wine and the bread into the blood and flesh of Christ during the core of the Mass at the time of the elevation of the host. And it cannot occur without the power of the Holy Spirit and the clergy having accepted the keys to their office and having lived by their vows and accepted certain vows. Only then can this occur a miracle in your presence, making Christ present once the miracle has occurred at the core of the Mass. It's a very sacred thing. And it's not easily explained to a lot of people, but it's called a real presence doctrine, and it became part of canon law. That's one of the three parts, isn't it? Canon law as of the Fourth Lateran Council under Innocent III. But here we have a heretic who is into transubstantiation. Obviously, we have somebody just pulling out words they remember from that time period. He was burned at the stake. Medium rare, we would assume here. He was burned at the stake. They disavowed his safe conduct pass, and he was burned near Constance. If you go on a vacation and you take a trip to Switzerland, and if you're in Constance, ask a guide, where might I go and observe the spot where John Huss was burned? Burned at the Council of Consistence. So it's close. That's right. Golden Bull, this has to do with electing the emperors of Germany, and the student said, had 7 rulers to pick the umpires. Need a familiar word here and there, and so forth. Now, papal schism, that's when we had 2 popes. And now we're going to run into some vulgarity again here, aren't we? Because there are 2 popes, and something must be done about it, and that's being dealt with early 1400s by the Council of Constance, right? But it is true, for a while there were 2 popes, and each one claimed to be the legitimate pope, so you have to ask yourself, what would be the action if you are pope, God's vicar on earth, the number 1 servant of God on earth, and have all of the power that goes with the papacy, excommunication, interdict, everything else? What will be your attitude or your action toward the other pope who is your rival? He can't be legitimate. If you're legitimate, can he? So they have the same attitude to each other, and one is in Rome, supported by some of the College of Cardinals, and one is in Avignon, supported by some of the College of Cardinals. Right? Both popes excommunicated and interdict each other. Yeah. Some popes that we had at that time, you say. All right. St. Augustine of Hippo, he's the seminal mind of the early church fathers, the 5 most important in the founding theological aspects of the early church. One of 3 roving bishops. I always thought of him as a little more important than that. Here we are back to indulgences, which I've already explained to you. All right? How they could be abused, but how they could properly be used. Sold in large numbers to mothers of babies born on crusades. Knocked purgatory time off your eternal life. That is accurate. Well, we don't know if they did. You can't really know that because you can't second guess God, and only God would have the power to do that. But that was the intent. If you were misled into thinking that would happen, that would be accurate to phrase it that way. I just thought it was rather an interesting way to say it. Reduces time in hell. The whole purpose of buying the indulgence is to get into heaven and never go to hell. Are justified because they add to God's wealth on earth. Now that student was onto something, because that was the reason for a general survey sale of a plenary indulgence in all of Western Europe, and particularly in Germany. And that's where Tetzel, the Dominican, was selling the indulgences and preaching the benefits of them, and he had a price to fit the pocket of anybody, whether you're a nobleman or a lowly peasant. And that's exactly the situation that was faced and observed by Luther, and Luther saw people crossing the border into his Saxony with pieces of paper. And Luther said, it's not in the book. And that's why Luther wrote his 95 Theses and tacked them on a door, which most scholars chose that means of arguing points that they would like to discuss. It's like setting a debate for something. So, but if they were sold, then they would add to the church's wealth. And one of the reasons they were being sold was to raise the money to pay back the Fugger banking house, which had forwarded in advance the funds for the commencement of the construction of that beautiful St. Peter's Cathedral that you see in Rome today. That was the commencement, and the large push came with Pope Julius II, who died in 1513, but it's still going on with Luther in 1517, but Julius II made the great push. He's the one who commissioned Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel, as you know. If a man was loose, he believed less and indulged more. Good example of, I don't know anything about it, but I want to fill some space, so I will fabricate something here right now. That's what you have. Back to the Crusades. Spread sickness. True. Furnished work for unemployed knights. But it's true. It did furnish work for unemployed knights. On Edward I of England, a student said, a savior of England or something like that. Now, this is the Edward, for those of you who have seen the film Braveheart, that is at odds with William Wallace. And this is the Edward who is called the English Justinian, responsible for the early development and the explosion almost in the use of statute law. So he made great contributions to the English Constitution and the development of Parliament because of his practices of calling representatives to treat with them. Now, he always needed money, and that's why he's calling them, but either way, the functioning of regular meetings of representatives with the crown, he's responsible for that. So when you study English history, he's a very important man. He's not just somebody evil that everyone who sees Braveheart dislikes. He was being the King of England is what he was doing. Scholasticism. Associated with St. Thomas Aquinas, later caused a spasm in the church. Now, what the student is aiming at there, scholasticism is a study of theological issues in one way or another, and attempting in the High Middle Ages with the arrival of Plato's very basic thought to harmonize those ideas with the reason elements of Plato and those of Aristotle and those techniques. And so most of the study of the 1100s and into the 1200s is generally collectively called scholasticism. And some thought that that's hardy work for all the elite, because the most elite degree you could have would be a master or a doctorate in theology. There are no other fields that you would go on to that level in, because that's where all truth is located, and truth can come from no other place except through the Scripture, the church, and theology. So that would be the ultimate degree. But for individuals to sit around and debate these fine questions as to how many angels might dance on the head of a pin, there are some who would criticize that and say, what are you doing for your fellow man? There's something involved in Christianity of which St. Francis of Assisi was the full embodiment, and we have individuals who are prosperous sitting around debating theological questions that do not make my man's life better off at all, and certainly doesn't involve any missionary work, which Christians are supposed to do, aren't they? So there was considerable controversy, and when the person says, later caused a spasm in the church, is implying that it was one of the causes for the schism that occurred in the future because of different views on the part of serious practicing Christians at that time. Thomas More, the Chancellor of Henry VIII of England, and a very religious man who never left the church and paid for it with his life, really his refusal for the oath to accept the king as the head of the church rather than the Pope, St. Thomas More thought scholasticism was worthless. What you ought to be doing is improving the world around you and doing something for your fellow man. That's the true Christian. And so his comment on scholasticism was, scholasticism is about as useful as milking a he-goat into a sieve. So, strong views on that, strong views on that. I told you that there was for a time period, 1378 until 1815, a pope in both Rome and in Avignon. Excuse me. And the popes in Avignon were criticized to a large degree, and they were certainly criticized in the writings of Petrarch, the Italian writer. So, writing on the Avignon papacy, which would be an example then of decline in morality of the church and other things, and that's the general theme if you're looking at the coming of the Reformation and what's the gripe of these individuals like Luther and John Calvin and others. Even John Huss earlier, what is it? So in writing on the Avignon papacy, a student said, things were so bad that the monks were practicing celibacy in the streets. I've even had celibacy spelled with an S. But either way, now what has really happened in that is the students have mixed up the word simony, S-I-M-O-N-Y, which is prohibited by the church, and it is prohibited because it is the selling of church offices. So when you need a new abbot for the monastery, because he has passed away, the office doesn't die, the lands don't die, only the abbot died. And if the local Duke of Northumberland has particular influence, one way or another, he might try to buy for his nephew that abbey, which means somebody who has the right to appoint that abbot is going to sell the office to the Duke of Northumberland for his nephew, Ethelbert. That's illegal and against canon and church law. Did it happen? Of course. Why did they have the law against it if it weren't happening? It was there. But either way, it's against the law. And anybody who's evil can practice if they want. That's what the student had in mind when they said monks were practicing celibacy in the streets. The Song of Roland, one of the great literary treasures of French history, probably put to pen in Old French, the earliest Old French, and that's why it's studied so much, not just for its story, but the evolution of the French tongue. But it's a story that had been told throughout the Middle Ages since 778, because that's when Charlemagne led his troops into Spain to fight against the Saracens, and that's when, returning from Spain, his rear guard, led by Roland, was attacked by not Muslims at all, but Christian Basques, and that's when Roland was killed. And so it's the story of Roland's heroic fight and struggle, and how he waits to the very last to call for help by blowing his horn, and he's aided by a bishop named Turpin, and they're slaying Muslims, and according to the work, they're slaying Muslims and defending themselves. And so it's a great story embellished with Christian deeds, like an epic situation, a Christian chivalry by the time it's put to pen in 1100, whereas it really dates from a story that occurred in 778. Very, very important. All right, here we have it. One student said, a song the troops used to sing to get inspired before they left on a crusade. And another said, a kind of jazzy chant. Good. Right. Another one says, was the real in song during the period of chivalry. All right, so we have rap. They had jazzy chants, didn't they? There we have a reference to the Council of Constance. That's the one that burned John Huss and was trying to solve the problem of having two popes, and they did elect a third, who became the new pope, Martin V. The student just referred to it as the Powerful Bottom Line Committee. Petrarch, who criticized the practices of popes in Avignon, the very immorality and despicable materialism of the city of Avignon, it was like a Western Babylon as far as he was concerned. And so one student referred to Petrarch as a starch Christian. I guess that improves you to starch yourself a little bit. Among the elements of Islam, and I asked students, write on some of the basic tenets or precepts or beliefs of Islam. All right? And students said it was so easy to understand that people really fall for it. Now, why did students say something like that? I'm sure it's because in a lecture I indicated that if you had to explain the intricacies of Christian evolution and Christian theology and teaching, as opposed to teaching about the basic tenets of the Muslim faith, you would be wiser to choose to explain the Muslim because it's much simpler. You have one God and Muhammad is his prophet. There are other prophets, but you only have one God. You do not have any Holy Trinity to explain, bolstered with Neoplatonic philosophical techniques, do you? And you don't have any of the trappings of all the traditional church laws and all the things. No. You have the Quran, simple teachings, it's straightforward, and you have 5 or 6 things that you should do with regularity, some of them 6 times a day, and that's it. So it's not complicated. So if you had to choose one, choose that one. In the Martian, if a Martian lands and you have to explain a religion on Earth to that Martian out in the field, choose the Muslim. Much easier job than explaining Christianity to him. The student must have remembered that. And so he says, it was so easy to understand that people really fall for it. I don't think any missionary would like to have that described as falling for something. Frederick II, he's known in history as Stupor Mundi, and he was one of the bright lights of the first half of the 13th century. a very curious man. He was a very good administrator and governor, became Holy Roman Emperor of Germany, but his roots were in Sicily and southern Italy, and he maintained a kind of capital and palace at Foggia, which is a no place today to visit, but there he often spent time. He had a very curious mind, very alert. He was very tolerant. He went on a crusade, negotiated with the Muslims, gained everything the Christians wanted by treaty so that all the pilgrims could go to the Holy Lands unobstructed by the Muslims. Everything's fine. The Pope excommunicated him for making a treaty with Muslims. But he was a tolerant individual, understood languages, so he's a little bit ahead of his time. He anticipates almost the kind of knowledge and understanding of the world that somebody during the Renaissance like Lorenzo the Magnificent might. And so Frederick is there with all of this in that century. And so he always impressed me. I'll tell you a couple of things about his curious mind. Frederick II decided he would like to know if the soul could be observed leaving the body. And so he had an individual who was certain to die, about to die, ensconced and sealed in a wine cask, and then had the cask observed 24 hours a day to see if the soul could be observed while leaving. And he also had children who had never heard sounds after they were born placed in an infirmary, and no sounds ever uttered around them, because he was trying to figure out, would the children grow up to speak the oldest language, Hebrew, which he concluded it was, or would they automatically speak the language of their parents, or would they automatically speak the language of the region where they were being raised? So here's a man with a curious mind. All right, here's what a student told me about Frederick. Was short, fat, bald with green eyes, but had class. I think he had lots of class. Really doesn't give me very much in the way of content, does it? Pico was one of the important writers during the Renaissance period in Renaissance Florence. And he was an avid debater and scholar of all sorts, and part of the humanistic revival at this time. And he's the one who once put 900 propositions, posted them, and said he would be willing to debate all 900 of them. He was a very tolerant man, and he thought that truth or benefits could be found in any body of thought anywhere in the world, so we could learn from Muslim teachings and the wisdom literature of the Muslims, from the Jews, from the Christians, from the Chinese, everybody. Be very tolerant, always have your mind open. This is a true Renaissance man with a humanistic outlook toward learning. So remember now, he would debate his 900 propositions here and defend all of them, a very tolerant man. Student says, was a very scholared figure. He said, we can learn as much as possible without becoming immortal. And third, he passed out flyers to help his cause. Most interesting. Those really aren't flyers when you post it on the wall. We have the Council of Constance again here. This is to clear up the double pope trouble. Fits right in, doesn't it? In the Renaissance Florence of Lorenzo the Magnificent, an evangelical, spirited, puritanical preacher, a Dominican monk named Savonarola, caused no end of problems and eventually gained control of the city after Lorenzo's death, not for his political purposes, but for his zealous religious views. He is the one who's responsible for burning obscene books, secular literature of one kind or another, baubles, jewelry, gaudy dresses, and all the other things that represent the flesh pot of the earth, in a large bonfire before the Palazzo Vecchio in the heart of the city of Florence. Right? If he were alive today, he would have had his own religious TV show. Now, think when the student might have written that. It was exactly at the time in which James Baker and Jimmy Swaggart were very, very prominent and in the news regularly as TV evangelists. And that's why it's phrased in that fashion at that time, because he seems to be dealing in that type of thing. Secularism is a word that I always encourage students to have in their vocabulary so that they can define in a single word what is something identified with religion or not identified with religion. I'm sitting in a classroom today that is part of a secular school, supported by tax money, correct? If I were at Loyola, it would be supported tuition and church money, wouldn't it? And it wouldn't be considered a secular school any more than Mount Carmel School is, elementary school down the way. So students should have that, because you can use that word secular to talk about the increase in the amount of literature that has no religious content or character whatsoever. Most of what you study in science is a very secular character, isn't it? And also what you study in sociology as such. So I encourage students to have that in their vocabulary and use it, and I often put it on exams, especially when you're talking about the growth of secularism at a particular time in history. Student says, unchurchly. And by the way, that's all the student said, was just unchurchly. Unchurchly. Indulgences, again, you know what they are. Student says, in order to receive them, you must be constrict of heart. We know that to be, of course, contrite of heart. Then sacraments, of which you know there are 7. And some people would know them immediately, some would have to be familiarized with those, and some students never become familiarized with what they are. But obviously they become an important issue during the Protestant Reformation, because the number that will be elevated to the level to be called sacraments will be only 3, as far as Martin Luther is concerned. And so there is friction there. If 7 are sacred, and of course 1 wouldn't even be there anyway, because Lutherans don't have holy orders, do they? Like the Universal Church does. All right, so under secularism, the student says, after last rites, misspelled, one is ready for the clergy. Now think about that. Last rites you receive after you're dead, or as you're certain to be dead. So after your last rites, you're ready for the clergy. Number 5 can be, the student says, sacrament number 5, without naming it, can be met simply by dieting. I don't know. I assume that has some reference to the fast and sacrificing something during Lent. Number 7 is called general holiness. Confirmation follows cataclysm. You know that confirmation follows the instructions so that you'd be prepared to take your first communion. Hence, confirmation commences, is followed by catechism, isn't it? In the 16th century now, we have John Knox, founder, expander, and leader of Calvinist Protestantism in Scotland. And Calvinist Protestantism is called in Scotland Presbyterianism. And it's called that because they established leaders of the church, like their elders for each parish, who were called presbyters, hence Presbyterianism. That's the reason that's associated with them, and you know the Presbyterian Church today. John Knox was an absolute evangelical, puritanical firebrand and a vociferous detester of anything that had a hint of the traditional Roman Church. Anything whatsoever. And keep in mind, now he's in Scotland, and who returns home to Scotland after living with her husband, a French king, and being nurtured in France since she was an adolescent, is Mary, Queen of Scots, Catholic. Can't you see it? Beautiful robes, no doubt rouge on her cheeks, baubles hanging in her ears. And you can imagine those dour, puritanical Scots standing on a wharf in simple, dull clothing, just staring silently. All right. So, John Knox, he called Jezebel a whore. That is true. But more to it than that, but the student didn't choose to write any more than that. He is referring, John Knox is, to Mary Tudor of England, one of the Catholic queens, a Catholic queen after Henry VIII, but just before Elizabeth the Great. And Mary could not turn back the clock all the way, but she was a Catholic and married His Most Catholic Majesty, Philip II of Spain. And she's the reason John Knox had to flee England at one time, and so he detests her. And so he wrote a work, a pamphlet type of work, and he was opposed to women rulers to begin with, and after all, he's putting up with Mary, Queen of Scots. Opposed to women rulers anyway, but especially Catholics. And so he attacked Mary Tudor, but included others in the general attack, and he entitled it first blast on the trumpet against the monstrous regiment of women. And in that he does openly refer to Mary Tudor, Queen of England, as a Jezebel, a harlot, and any number of other things. So hence the student, not remembering a lot about that, just simply said, he called Jezebel a whore. John Calvin, this is the founder now of the church of which John Knox is a member. Knox is a follower of Calvin. He went to Geneva, Switzerland to study under Calvin. And under Calvin, Geneva became almost a theocracy with no distinction between the authority of the elders of the church, the practices of the church, enforcing the regulations and rules of the church, just like blue laws, as we might say. Your conduct in your dress. You don't wear things in your ears. No makeup of any kind. You name your children after Old Testament personalities. Why? You don't want to name them something like John or Paul, do you? Those are Catholic names. So you want to name them Ezekiel, Hezekiah, Jeremiah. See, nothing really Catholic about all that, is there particularly? So very, very strong. And Geneva was in effect a theocracy, just like a church-administered entity, city-state, as such. So John Calvin, the founder of Calvinism, believed we predestined our lives. That refers to Calvin's doctrine of predestination, which says that God has decided, even before man was created, who will be saved and who will be lost. It's already been decided. He's already handed down his decree. Nothing you can do in your life will ever change that. And you might ask, why should I then conform to good Christian conduct if that's true, seeing as it's already been decided and I can't influence by my deeds? It is your obligation as a good Christian, and if you prove it by your conduct, to make certain that others conform to the rules and regulations of good Christian teachings. So the commandments will be maintained, and you have your obligation to make certain other members of the community maintain them. And those who can't maintain them, we might assume, probably aren't one of those minority who God has already chosen, or they would be able to keep those commandments, wouldn't they? You know those kind of people. You've read novels. Those are the kind of people that someday will probably be wearing around a scarlet letter, aren't they? You can tell them. Right. But predestination. So he says, we predestined our lives. Michael Cerveda was exercised by Calvin. He really means Calvin executed Michael Servetus in Geneva. Because Michael Servetus studied the Bible and said the line that indicates a virgin shall conceive can be interpreted also as a young woman shall conceive, because he studied his Greek and his Hebrew, and it could mean either. That is a serious heresy, and it's not a heresy in the Roman Church, is it? It's a heresy in Calvin's mind and view, isn't it? And Michael Servetus had fled from other authorities because of his writings and his pantheism and saying God is in everything. And Calvin detested that kind of talk. Calvin said, you scamp. You mean when I stamp on the floor, I'm stamping on God? You scamp. You ought to burn. And he did burn. He did burn. And he was condemned in Protestant, Calvinist Switzerland, not by any papal inquisition in any fashion. John Calvin again. Right? The student says, was a firm believer in Calvinism. That's good. That's like saying Fidel Castro is a firm believer in Castroism. Okay? Right on the money there. His followers believed in predestination. Pretty close to predestination, isn't it? Was a reasonalist who founded the Jesuits, which would make a teacher like me laugh, because there's nothing wider apart than Jesuits and Calvinists. Nothing could be further apart than that. Erasmus, the greatest humanist of the northern part of Europe in the entire Renaissance period. And he remained a Catholic all of his life, was attacked by Luther later because he did not rebel against the church, but he took holy orders and became a member of the clergy. It was the avenue for study and scholarship, and that's what he enjoyed, being around books and other things. And it's a way to survive, because you might be the secretary of a bishop or someone else, and it's a means of travel and sustenance. But he found out that he had taken these vows, like celibacy, and he couldn't live by them. The French women were too lovely. And he couldn't hold those vows, but the point is he wasn't a hypocrite. He isn't the type that would take the vows and then keep a woman on the side or have illegitimate children and still wear his clerical garb around and benefit economically from it. So he gave up his vows because he couldn't do that. And then he spent much of his life criticizing the clergy, be they monks, priests, or popes, for their conduct of taking vows and not living according to the basic precepts of Christianity. There shouldn't even be wars, and no Christian prince should fight another Christian prince. So, he is very witty, he throws his barbs, he is being read throughout the centuries since that time because of his witticisms and the way he says things. But he makes it crystal clear. Man isn't made for celibacy. He knows that's true. We have too many men who have taken the vows that aren't practicing it. Therefore, we shouldn't have the vow to begin with. That's what he's criticizing. You don't understand human nature. Matter of fact, he went so far as to say, when you walk down the street and you meet a lady who is pregnant, you should doff your hat to her and say this: pray the exit will be as easy as the entrance was. That's what you should do. Because what are you doing? You're pointing out the goatish desire on the part of mankind toward pleasures of the flesh, and it's a reality of life. So you should live a life accordingly and take that into account and do as much as you can for your Christian brethren. Don't worry about angels on the pin, right? Head of a pin. Don't worry about that. Worry about your fellow man. And don't take vows you can't keep. Don't even have vows that are unkeepable. He wrote, one of his major works is called In Praise of Folly. And the folly is all the things that we do that are not reasonable. And he's pointing to the fact that so many things we do not follow reason because we do many of our things by instinct or passion or emotion. And so he is talking about the follies and foibles of mankind. He even wrote one satire on Pope Julius II, our friend that appointed Michelangelo, and who was a warrior pope and led his own armies. And he wrote one satire on him, Julius attempting to get into heaven and can't quite make it because St. Peter and the others around St. Peter can't seem to recognize him because, one, he doesn't look like a pope. Secondly, he smells like puke, gunpowder, brothels, and booze. So Erasmus is very outspoken, isn't he? The student said his greatest work was The Follies. Not quite right. He gave up clery, should be clergy, because he could not keep his vowels. Pretty close. All right. Let's go on to Spiritual Exercises, the most important writing of Ignatius Loyola, the founder of the important order Society of Jesus that you know as Jesuits. That's a term that has stuck, Jesuits, and it's accepted respectably. It didn't start out that way. And it was something foisted upon them like Whigs as a party in England, but later retained and kept. Most Protestants like John Knox and John Calvin wouldn't use the word Jesuit, they would say Jesuiters, because there was tremendous religious animosity and it came out in their verbiage and writing continually during that century. Now, Spiritual Exercises, a writing of Loyola is a formula for how you can examine yourself, how you can come to peace with your body, with your physical and sensual desires in your body, your worry about vanity, what your hair looks like, and your consciousness of that, and remove all of that and come closer and closer in simplicity to God. It also prepares you for obedience. So if you're not worried and not concerned about your own self-interest or any selfishness whatsoever, you are totally selfless and you've almost self-hypnotized. You are in that frame of mind in which you can totally obey. If someone says that this is black, you see black. That's the state of mind that you want to enter. And Loyola wrote that as instructions for his followers, and he founded an order that is an elite order, and it has 4 steps, more elite each time, within the order, organized on a military basis, and the head of the order is called a general, and he resides in Rome. So, very, very important, this type of mental thinking, self-concentration. Student writing on spiritual exercises, a mind-expanding type of exercise used by Luther as a self-punishment. A special physical movement of the body while saying paternosters. So I guess, what do? You do jumping jacks and say a paternoster as you're doing a jumping jack? That's all that can mean. Spiritual exercises. Right? Under Jesuits, I already told you what a strict, dedicated, well-educated, university-founding order they are. Okay, here we go. Jesuits were a religious Marine Corps. Were established along with the Loyolas. It's not too far afield. It was founded by Loyola. Part of the Counter-Reformation was a group of stormtroopers known as the Jesuits. I never thought of them as stormtroopers, but either way it could be. Now Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, I just said Loyola. This student said, the main scholastic factory of the time. And another said, a kind of cardinal's grad school. Pretty good, eh? Very easy. He has the concept that it's definitely elite within the Universal Church, an elite order in that sense. Again, back to our friend John Knox, the firebrand in Scotland who attacked women rulers and particularly Catholics. Wrote a blasphemous against women princes. Wrote a famlet on women. Was a very Protestant man, certainly was. Was an early extreme chauvinist. We today talk about male chauvinism. His pamphlet attacks women. Therefore, we have an early extreme chauvinist. And that idea that it is decided before you are born for all individuals and all creatures who is to be saved and who is not. Those are the elect. You are, if you are the elect, predestined to salvation. That is a doctrine, the proper word for it, in the teachings of John Calvin. He gleaned it from Holy Scripture, New Testament teachings of Paul. He didn't dream it up. But Calvin believed in that, and he believed that that's the way an all-powerful God would do it anyway. After all, why should he concede anything to lowly fallen man to have the chance to do things to participate in his own salvation? God is God, man is nothing, and ever since the Garden of Eden, infected with the rot of sin. Therefore, God has already decided somebody as lowly as man can't be involved in the decision of whether you go or. Predestination, that's what it is. One of Calvin's pet peeves. There's a student who hasn't run into the word pet peeve yet. A friend in political science told me that a student told him last year on an exam that one of the problems with capitalism is it can create a dog-eat-dog world. Another term that one hasn't seen, right? Sacraments. We all know there are 7 sacraments, commencing with baptism, right? You move on through confirmation, communion, right? Common people had to keep 6/7 of them. That is true. Laymen do. Only holy orders would take the 7th sacrament and join a holy order. Included extramunction, you've run into that before, were important in medieval time. Then Julius Exclusus. I referred to before a writing by Erasmus in which he criticized the Pope and made the Pope quite unrecognizable in attempting to enter the pearly gates because he was criticizing the conduct of that Pope on this earth. Right? That is Julius II, the man who commissioned the Sistine Chapel, of course, and that's for which he's best known for those who visit and travel in his art. Under Julius Exclusus, written by Erasmus, it says, Criticisms of the Filthy Glove of Popedom, written by Immersus, a member of the clergy. The Pope sent Angelo to paint the 16th chapel. How do you like that? The 16th chapel. When I saw that, I wrote in the margin immediately, could you tell me where the other 15 are so I could visit them also? Machiavelli, right? Our man of end justifies the means, the man writing on power politics. There's only one answer, seize power, and after you have that, maintain power. You are defective if you lose power, and you will trust the goodness of no one else. Under any circumstances, use anything you need to hold on to that power. That's your formula, isn't it? Written right at the time of the High Renaissance, written in the early 1500s after he had served for a while in Florentine government, in a city-state region of Europe in which there were ambassadors, constant wars, power politics, intermingling of all kinds. Machiavelli said the end justifies the ends. And he said, and this is perfect in our time, said, don't lay back, man. Fits very well, doesn't it, with the kind of slang and terminology today. Calvinist theocracy. Remember Calvin, Geneva, no separation between church and state in the administering and maintenance of the laws of God and what you would call secular laws of the city. Was a bad thing if you were having fun. Calvin was a bad man who was always wrathing over the people. I see there a student who had not had a chance before to ever use the word wrath. And I must have said at some time that hovering over you at all times is that horrible decree and the wrath of God. Must have said that because here we have a present participle called wrathing. And I had never used that myself before, but I'm wrong. I guess you can wrath. This is possible. Back to the Jesuits. Here's a nice phrase. Were a strict bunch of smart monks. Pretty good. Were scholars and often kicked out of debates. Well, they might, because they very likely might win them if they were smart monks, which they were smart monks. No doubt about that. Then our Pope, Julius II again, the warrior Pope. Here he's called the Worrier Pope, and then he's called Pope Judas, kept trying to get into heaven. So he didn't even have Julius down there. The Reformation, you know, the transformation and the movement of Protestantism in Germany in the 16th century. In Germany, especially the Catholics were becoming the dirt of the earth. 17th century, let's move on here. Cardinal Richelieu, who you've seen portrayed in movies always about the Three Musketeers, and he's usually portrayed as a sinister and evil type of somebody who manipulates and doesn't carry out the interests of Louis XIII of France, and yet he's the most able minister that Louis XIII could have had, who was a reasonably lazy king and needed an able minister and supported that minister. And everything Richelieu does, he does to build the power of France, the power of the monarchy, all those things that are complementary to what any king would want their aide to be doing. But that doesn't fit well when you're writing fiction and having fun and writing something interesting that makes a wonderful story, like The Count of Monte Cristo, right, or The Three Musketeers, and things of that vein. So it works out better, again. But either way, he was very, very dedicated, very excellent administrator and diplomat in strengthening the crown and the position of France in Europe, involving both domestic and foreign activity. Students said he was a screwed and dictated man. We assume there the student means he was a shrewd and dedicated man. And either way, he believed in his own cause. It's always nice to believe in your own cause. Louis XIV, one of the greatest of modern French kings, had an important aide and a bishop he appointed, Bishop of Meaux, who was a writer and who wrote defending absolute and divine God-sanctioned monarchy as a wondrous thing. And that was beneficial to Louis, but the truth is Bossuet was a very holy man and lived a very strict life and would have lived up to his personal vows as a bishop. And you know that Louis XIV is a king is a king, and a king is a king is a king is a king. So he's going to have, at least in his early years, a chain of mistress and conquests of one kind or another, and he's going to have a slew of bastard children and other things, and you're going to have somebody be the supervisor of the bastards at a particular location, and this time. He's a king. Now, Bossuet obviously couldn't condone that, but he can't defy his king, because after all, he even writes things that says kingship is God's form of government, so therefore Louis must be appointed by God, so you can't defy God and oppose Louis, can you? No one should. So this is Bishop Bossuet. He wrote and performed Le Cid in the 11th century. Okay, I was telling you 17th century. Here we've got him performing a play in the 11th century, a play based on a Spanish epic. He criticized, not criticized, he criticized Louis for floundering with women. Wow, this student must have known something about Louis that I did not. He may have philandered, but I didn't know he floundered. That wouldn't suggest to be the case. All right. Then we have here Versailles, you know, the greatest palace ever built to date at that time. Ostentatious display of glass everywhere, right? The grounds, you put 12, 15 of this campus in the grounds of Versailles. So the majesty and power took 20 plus years to build it. Eventually, 10,000 regular residents and enough servants to make it 30,000 with all their horses and accoutrements living there. Right? So a student was asked to write on this, and they could write a paragraph on this. I will come back to Versailles in a little bit, and you will see what I'm talking about. Student said this was the in place in Europe. Then on John Locke, the philosopher on which much of our contract theory of government for the United States is framed, we have John Locke. He argued against everything he was not for. He said that bad government must be evicted, which essentially is true, right? And a student who had no idea what to write said this: John Locke, the latch on the bathroom door, dash, sorry. 18th century partition treaties, you no doubt, if you are old enough, will recall when Metrocal was the best-selling liquid diet for people reducing weight. And one of the common commercials you would see on television was 2 or 3 youthful women, well underweight, 10 pounds underweight, so forth, dancing here and there saying, "We are the Metrocal for lunch bunch." Well, during the last part of the 18th century, Russia, Austria, and Prussia cooperated in partitioning Poland out of existence. So by the time we get to the 1790s, there is no Poland. None whatsoever. All of the territory belongs to one or the other, all divided up. Now, you can tell exactly when this exam was given by what the student said. All right? In the 18th century, Austria, Russia, and Prussia were the Poland for lunch bunch. Absolutely accurate, isn't it? Doesn't say much about it, but that's accurate. Philosophe, those are the thinkers of the 18th century who are not philosophers, but individuals who are polemicists, who write on any number of other things, like Diderot, who did the great dictionary, multi-volume dictionary, and Voltaire, volumes of writing of all kinds, whether it's plays, poetry, fiction, criticism one way, philosophical tales, Montesquieu, Spirit of the Laws, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Social Contract, essays of all kinds. So those are philosophes. Those individuals used reason in thinking. Using reason for thinking was the big thing then. And also they criticized. A lot of individuals engage in using criticized, right? Here's just a simple statement I gleaned from an exam. Italy was unified, but not very unified in its unity. And from Nietzsche, religion kept human race a hero of average sheep. Now, obviously, he opposes the herd mentality, doesn't he? But he is saying that religion, turning the other cheek, forgiving and forgiving, right? Love thy neighbor, right? Sacrifice, all those things keep individuals and make individuals. The meek shall inherit the earth. There's a good one. All of those things keep society and Western civilization exactly where it is. We have to strive onward and upward in some way. We can't do it when we have Christian principles like that. Socialism, leveling also. We can't have that. Democracy, leveling also. But the student statement is, religion kept human race a hero of average sheep. And then the plan by France for a swift move as fast as they could to Paris in the opening of the war, which would require they enter and pass through a foreign country. Students said, reach Paris quickly by abrupt swing through Bulgaria. Bulgaria is down by the Black Sea. So you would enhance by maybe 2 months your trip if you were to march an army there. Right. And here's another one, and this is the ultimate I've ever had on Versailles, and I need to tell you some things about it. Students said about Versailles, and you know what a great palace it is, and write anything they wanted about it. That was the place during the 17th century where Louis XIV and his nobles used to hang out. Now the student really referred to nobles, N-O-B-L-E-S, but the student didn't write nobles, didn't spell it that way. He spelled it this way. So when I saw it, it would have been funny if he had spelled nobles correctly, because I can't imagine using the term hang out for somebody like Louis XIV and the greatest aristocracy of France. They are individuals of sumptuous position. They're not hanging out. But the idea of spelling it that way made it very, very humorous when I read it. And then I reported this to a colleague of mine who taught British or English and European intellectual and cultural history of modern Europe. And Richard Barlow. And Richard said, no student wrote that, Smith. You concocted that, you made that up. No student wrote that. So I Xeroxed it because I hadn't turned the exams back yet and showed it to him. And he looked at it and he realized I wasn't fabricating it. And then he said to me, Smith, give the student some points for that, because that student may know something about the 17th century aristocracy that you don't. So that's always a possibility, isn't it? I have some others, but I am not going to place them down because they are not printed large enough for you to see them, but I'll comment on some of them for you. One of the contributors to the agricultural revolution in the late 18th century was an individual named Jethro Tull, J-E-T-H-R-O, like our first name Jethro, and then Tull, T-U-L-L. And Jethro Tull, very distinguished, contributed a great deal, but you would have to conclude that that's a dull name, and that's a dull topic. No student would become excited about it. There was a period in which all students paid attention when I gave his name, and I always would give his name in connection with the developments of the agricultural changes at that time and advancement, because there was a period in the 70s in which one of the popular rock groups was called Jethro Tull. Then as we move up to modern times, you don't have that to lean on to aid you in interesting students in the agricultural revolution in any way, because they're not familiar with them, because it's a group of the past. But I had a student recently who hadn't seen the name in print write the name Jeff as the first name, and the last name was Rotull. But either way, at that time, writing on it, a student said this about Jethro Tull and his contributions. Really, most of his contribution had to do with crop rotation, proper fertilizers and crop rotation to re-enrich the soil. Okay. Jethro Tull figured out a way to farm without leaving out the dirt. And I don't know if I can myself figure out what that means. Figure out a way to farm without leaving out the dirt. All right. Frederick the Great, who greatest general probably in the 18th century and the leader of Prussia, and had to fight against Elizabeth of Russia, had to fight against Maria Theresa of Austria, and he had to fight against France during his lifetime. And of course France, Louis XV, but a lot of influence by Marie de Pompadour, or Madame de Pompadour. So you have three women involved in his life that are influential in the foreign policy of their particular states, and so therefore he would be conscious of a situation where he is confronted on all sides with the forces of women. He said, wanted to fight all three women because they caused him stress. And I guess that would be stress. He was as great as Peter the Great because he failed at everything he did. Is that the way you become as great as Peter the Great? I don't know. The most interesting utterance by Frederick the Great about the women around him was that he referred to Madame de Pompadour, a very distinguished and elegant and educated and sophisticated lady, but she wasn't from royalty or even nobility. Her real name was Poisson, last name, and that means fish. So she was elevated to status as a mistress to Louis XV. He always referred to her in print, public, where anybody could read it, even in communications abroad, as Madame Poisson, meaning Madame Fish. And then, openly, he would refer to Elizabeth of Russia as simply Catin du Nord, which translates from the French as slut from up north. Frederick knew how to say things the way he wanted to say them in all of that. All right. There was a Czech historian and writer in the mid-19th century named Karel Havlicek, just like the basketball player Havlicek. This student said he was a Czech, C-H-E-C-K, who hated poles, the kind that you see put telephone poles, I think. A Czech who hated poles. And Charles Darwin, we all know Charles Darwin, right? Charles Darwin said that the earth kept getting older and older as scientists kept working on it. Yes, I guess it would, wouldn't it? Yeah. Marx, student had to write on what was the Marxian view of women. And of course, Marx is talking about the bourgeoisie exploit women. Bourgeoisie practices cause prostitution. Here's what a student said. Marx said that women were a burden. True, but a necessary part of production or reproduction to be used whenever necessary. And Thomas Malthus, who wrote on population and said that's one of the most serious questions that we face, the increase of humans beyond the food supply. And that is very, very severe. But you can't engage in welfare, because if you engage in welfare, you make it easy for those who are without to have something and enough for them to have more children. And as a result, you will increase the population for the next generation, and you will contribute to a greater amount of misery on earth because you increase the population the generation down. So you mustn't make it easier for these that are starving now. You must not. And he is a Christian pastor, and he would tell you his aim is to reduce the amount of misery. Student said this. Malthus said, let them starve to death, and that way maybe they will learn. I guess maybe they might learn if that were the case. Right? Writing on Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, the student said, a woman gets pregnant as a part of the bourgeoisie. Townspeople, another student said, townspeople that wanted to change and revolted for 2 weeks, but some didn't know why, and they eventually quit. I don't even know how to evaluate statements like that. And before we finish, let me give you some things modern. You know Pierre Laval, chief minister through most of the period of Vichy France. You have a trial going on in Paris, in France right now, not in Paris, involving collaboration with the Germans, right? Cooperation during the Vichy period. Pierre Laval was the chief minister in that activity for 4 years under Marshal Pétain during Hitler's dominance of Europe. Student said, Pierre Laval, guilty of coagulation with the Germans, right? Okay. John Maynard Keynes, the great economist in the 20th century, one student said, he was big on economics. That fits in with those kind of phrases that students write in exams when they say, he was a very important man about that time. Okay? John Maynard Keynes was well known for his clarity in his writing on economics. That's filling space, right? There are those who say, and then there are those who say, was a well-educated Englishman who said the peace treaty, T-R-E-A-D-Y, violated the basic principles. Right? And another person said that von Schlieffen planned to invade France fast. Most of the strategies that were aimed at Russian borders, and the borders are the kind that live at your room and board or your boarding house and all of that. And then at the English naval race, a student said, Admiral Tidbits, instead of Tirpitz, because of him, the English had to build super battleship Drugnats. That should be battleship and dreadnoughts. And then, through development of naval powers, Russia did gain stature abroad. None of this fits, but naval powers is spelled Navel, which I will close with because it reminds me of an old historical joke. And it goes this way. During the naval struggle between Octavian and Cleopatra, there was a tremendous loss of seamen. And I will end with that. Good night, Chet.